A young nurse risked her life by taking a bullet for a man she didn't know. When she woke up, she couldn't believe her eyes. Ruth was heading to work that evening to resume her shift when it all happened. The streets of New York buzzed with life, neon signs flickering, the distant hum of car horns filling the air. As she walked past a roadside restaurant, she noticed him, a man in a well-tailored suit, seated with friends, laughing over snacks. He was a businessman, powerful and influential, but with too many enemies. On numerous occasions, he had narrowly escaped assassination attempts. But tonight, luck was not on his side. Now Ruth happened. She was only a few steps away when she noticed the figure lurking nearby. A man, tense and focused, pulling a gun from his jacket. His target was clear. Without a second thought, Ruth moved. Her feet barely touched the ground as she lunged forward, shoving the businessman out of harm's way. A deafening crack split the air. Pain. Searing, blinding pain shot through her shoulder. The world tilted, spinning out of focus as she collapsed. Everything faded into darkness. The chaos around her was immediate. Screams filled the air, chairs clattered to the ground, and restaurant patrons scrambled in every direction. Some ducked behind tables, others ran into the street. The businessman, still in shock, looked around frantically, realizing what had just happened. A stranger, a woman, had thrown herself in front of him, taking the bullet meant for him. The shooter, momentarily stunned, turned to flee. But before he could disappear into the night, several bystanders tackled him to the ground. A few brave souls wrestled the gun from his hands, pinning him until the police arrived. Sirens blared in the distance, their wails cutting through the night like a warning of the mayhem that had just unfolded. Meanwhile, Ruth lay motionless on the pavement, her dark scrubs now stained with blood. The businessman crawled toward her, shaking her gently. "Stay with me," he pleaded, his voice thick with desperation. "Help is coming." But Ruth's body was heavy, her vision blurry. She fought to keep her eyes open, but the pain was overwhelming. Then, darkness. When Ruth woke, everything was bright, almost too bright. The rhythmic beeping of machines filled her ears, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night before. The sterile scent of antiseptic invaded her senses, grounding her back to reality. She was in a hospital. Her body ached, especially her shoulder, which was now heavily bandaged. As she blinked against the harsh light, her gaze landed on a figure sitting beside her bed. The businessman. But he wasn't the confident, laughing man she had seen at the restaurant. Now, he looked different, tired, shaken. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened. And then she realized he was crying. At that moment, he lifted his head and met her gaze. Relief flooded his face. He stood quickly, wiping his eyes, composing himself. "You're awake," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Ruth swallowed, her throat dry. "Where am I?" "The hospital," he answered softly. "You took a bullet for me." The memory came rushing back. The street, the restaurant, the gunman. The pain. She winced slightly and adjusted her position. "I guess I did." He let out a shaky breath. "Why?" Ruth didn't know how to answer that. It wasn't something she had thought about in the moment. She had simply acted. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was her training as a nurse. Maybe it was something else entirely. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just couldn't let it happen." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, he reached into his coat and pulled out something small, placing it on the bedside table. A set of car keys. "In this," he said, placing an envelope beside the keys. $500,000. "It's the least I can do." Ruth stared at the items in disbelief. "I can't accept this." "You saved my life," he insisted. "If you hadn't done what you did, I wouldn't be standing here. I owe you everything." Tears welled in Ruth's eyes. It wasn't about the money or the car. It was the sheer magnitude of what had happened. She had nearly died. Her life had changed in an instant. And now, this man, this stranger, was determined to make sure she never had to struggle again. Days passed, and Ruth found herself in a strange, unfamiliar routine. She had always been the one taking care of others, running through hospital halls, checking vital signs, offering words of comfort. But now, she was the one confined to a hospital bed, staring at white walls and ceiling tiles, feeling useless. And the businessman, the stranger whose life she had saved, was always there. At first, his presence was impersonal, almost businesslike, as if repaying a debt. He made arrangements for the best doctors, ensured her room was private, spoke to the staff in that low, authoritative tone of his. He never made a scene, but his presence commanded attention. It didn't take long for the nurses to start whispering about him. "That's Michael Carter," one of them murmured outside her room one morning. "The Michael Carter, the billionaire," another asked in hushed surprise. "Yes, you know, the one who—" Ruth had stopped listening. She wasn't interested in who he was. What mattered was why he kept coming back. At first, she had expected him to leave once she was stable. Maybe a single visit to say thanks. Maybe some extravagant gift before he went back to his world of power and wealth. But he didn't leave. Every morning, she would wake up and find him in the chair beside her bed, reading something on his phone or sipping black coffee from a paper cup. Every evening, when the city lights spilled through the hospital window, she would glance over and see him still there, jacket draped over the chair, sleeves rolled up, exhaustion tugging at his features. It took her days to finally acknowledge it. One evening, when she stirred awake to find him in his usual spot, she couldn't help but break the silence. "You don't have to be here every day, you know." Michael looked up, his tired blue eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of something, guilt, maybe. "I want to be," he admitted. She studied him for a moment, as if trying to decipher his motives. "Why?" A pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Because I owe you more than just money or gifts." He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I should have been the one in this hospital bed, not you." Ruth frowned. "That's not how life works." His jaw tightened. "It should be." She could hear the weight behind his words, something deeper than guilt. She recognized that kind of burden, the kind that sat on your chest, heavy and suffocating. "What's your name?" she asked, breaking the tension. He blinked, as if surprised she didn't already know. "Michael." She nodded. "Well, Michael, you can stop feeling guilty. I made a choice that night. And I'd do it again." He looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. "You shouldn't have had to." A silence stretched between them, one that wasn't uncomfortable but held something unspoken. Then, for the first time since that night, they talked. It started small. She asked about his work. He inquired about her recovery. But soon, the walls crumbled, piece by piece. Michael wasn't just a businessman. He was the CEO of a high-profile investment firm, the kind of man who made deals that changed industries. With power, however, came enemies. Ruth learned that the attempt on his life hadn't been random. He had made powerful enemies, people who played dangerous games. That night outside the restaurant hadn't been an isolated event. It was the moment his luck had run out. In return, she told him about her life. About growing up in Brooklyn, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs. About how she had always dreamed of becoming a nurse, but had to fight for every step, working long shifts just to afford school. Michael listened, truly listened, as if every word she spoke was something rare and valuable. "You're incredible," he murmured one night after she told him about her mother's sacrifices. Ruth laughed softly. "I don't know about that." "No, really," he insisted. "You've been through so much. And yet, you risked your life for someone you didn't even know." He shook his head. "That's not something most people would do." She looked down at her hands. "I just did what felt right." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a soft sigh, he leaned back. "You make me rethink a lot of things, Ruth." Ruth had spent the past week in a sterile hospital room, confined to crisp white sheets and the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors. The days had blurred together, doctors checking in, nurses adjusting her for, Michael always sitting by her bedside. The pain in her shoulder had dulled, replaced by an ache she couldn't quite name, a feeling that something in her life had shifted irreversibly. Now, as she stood by the hospital's entrance, breathing in the fresh city air for the first time in days, the world felt different. She wasn't just Ruth, the night shift nurse anymore. She was Ruth, the woman who had thrown herself in front of a bullet for a man she didn't know. A hero, the newspapers had called her. It felt surreal. The sidewalk bustled with life, cars honking, people rushing past with their own worries, their own stories. The world hadn't paused for her. And yet, hers had changed forever. Michael was waiting beside his car. The sleek black vehicle looked out of place in front of the hospital entrance, drawing stares from passers-by. He stood next to it, hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Concern? Guilt? Something more? "You sure you're ready?" he asked as she approached. Ruth smirked. "If I stay in that hospital one more second, I might lose my mind." He exhaled a small laugh, then opened the passenger door for her. She hesitated for half a second before getting in, feeling the soft leather beneath her fingertips. It was nothing like the worn-down seats of the subway or the occasional taxi she took home after long shifts. As he slid into the driver's seat and pulled onto the street, silence stretched between them, comfortable, yet waited. Her eyes drifted to the car parked outside the hospital. Her car. The one Michael had gifted her, along with a check that still sat in her bag. $500,000. Enough to change her life completely. She had stared at the check for hours the night before, turning it over in her hands, tracing the ink with her fingers, trying to understand how a single moment of bravery had led to this. It felt unreal. The city lights flickered against the windshield as they drove, the familiar streets passing in a blur. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about her next shift, the next bill, the next step in her routine. Instead, she was thinking about fate. Does it feel different? Michael's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to look at him. What? Everything, he said, keeping his eyes on the road. After what happened, she sighed, leaning her head back against the seat. Yeah, it does. She had always been the one tending to others. Now, strangers called her a hero, reporters wanted interviews, and her life had taken a turn she never expected. Michael nodded as if he understood. Maybe he did. You changed my life, Ruth, he said after a moment. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. Not just because you saved it, but because I've never met anyone like you. She swallowed. There was a sincerity in his voice that made her chest tighten. I wasn't looking to change anything, she murmured. Sometimes, fate doesn't give us a choice. The word, fate, lingered in the air between them. She thought about that night, about how she had simply been walking to work, about how her life had been so ordinary just seconds before she saw the gun. Would things have turned out the same if she had left home 5 minutes later? If she had taken a different route? Or was she meant to be there? She shook the thoughts away. Where are we going? She asked, realizing she hadn't given him her address. Michael smirked. I figured we'd grab some food first. You've been eating hospital meals for a week. That's practically torture. Ruth raised a brow. Michael, are you asking me on a date? His smirk faltered slightly, replaced by something more serious. No, I'm making sure you don't go home alone and spend the night overthinking everything. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Because he was right. As much as she wanted to pretend everything was normal, it wasn't. So she let him take her to a quiet restaurant on the Upper East Side. It wasn't fancy, at least, not compared to what she imagined he was used to. It was cozy, tucked between towering buildings, the kind of place that smelled like freshly baked bread and home. As they sat in a booth near the window, Ruth took a deep breath. She had spent the past week surrounded by doctors, forced to sit still, to rest, to think. Now, she wanted to feel normal again. You know, she said, picking at the napkin in her lap. This isn't what I expected when I clocked in for my shift last week. Michael huffed a laugh. Trust me, it wasn't what I expected either. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. They were two people whose lives had collided in the most unexpected way. And now, neither of them could go back to who they were before. Ruth stood by her apartment window, gazing at the New York skyline as the city pulsed with life beneath her. The soft hum of distant traffic, the glow of neon signs, the rhythmic footsteps of people chasing their own stories. It all felt both familiar and foreign. It had been months since that night, since the gunshot, since she had thrown herself in front of a stranger, altering the course of her life forever. She traced her fingers absent-mindedly over the thin scar on her shoulder, a permanent reminder of the moment that had rewritten her fate. The pain had faded, but the weight of everything that came after still lingered in her heart. She was no longer just Ruth, the night shift nurse struggling to make ends meet. She was Ruth, the woman whose courage had made headlines, the woman whose act of selflessness had led to unexpected friendships, new opportunities, and a life she had never dared to dream of. And at the center of it all was Michael. He wasn't just the businessman she had saved anymore. He was a constant presence, a steady force that had refused to fade into the background of her life. At first, she had expected their connection to be temporary, born out of gratitude and circumstance. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, he never left. He called. He visited. He listened. Somewhere along the way, he had become more than just a reminder of what happened that night. He had become important. A sharp knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She already knew who it was before she even turned the handle. Michael stood there, dressed casually for once. No tailored suit, no polished shoes, just a dark sweater and jeans that made him seem ordinary. Except Michael was anything but ordinary. "Hey," he said, offering her a small smile. "Hey yourself," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. He carried a bag from her favorite coffee shop, placing it on the counter as he leaned against the kitchen island like he had done 100 times before. "You were thinking again," he observed. Ruth rolled her eyes. "I think all the time, Michael. You know what I mean." She sighed, crossing her arms. "I was just remembering." He nodded, his gaze flickering to the scar on her shoulder before meeting her eyes. "It feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it?" "Yeah," she exhaled. "It really does." They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unspoken settling between them. Then Michael spoke, his voice quieter this time. "If you could go back, would you do it all over again?" Ruth didn't hesitate. "Yes." His expression shifted, something unreadable passing through his eyes before he nodded. "You never had to do it, you know," he said, his voice laced with something close to guilt. "But I did do it. And I'd do it again," she said, stepping closer. "Because it wasn't just about saving your life, Michael. It was about doing the right thing. It was about who I am." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "And now? Who are you now, Ruth?" She considered that for a moment. She had changed in ways she hadn't even realized at first. The woman she had been before, overworked, exhausted, constantly worrying about bills, felt like a ghost of a past life. Michael's generosity had given her financial security. The check had cleared her debts, allowed her to breathe without the suffocating weight of loans and overdue notices. But more than that, she had been given something far greater. For the first time in years, she wasn't simply surviving. She was living. She had taken a break from work, something she never imagined she would do. She had traveled, seen places beyond the walls of the hospital and the crowded streets of Brooklyn. She had met people who saw her as more than just a nurse. And she had Michael. Not because she had saved his life, but because somewhere along the way, he had become part of hers. "I think," she finally answered, "that I'm still figuring it out. But I'm not afraid of what comes next." Michael watched her carefully, as if weighing every word. Then he smiled, genuine, warm, proud. "Good," he said. "Because you deserve everything that's coming." She tilted her head. "And what exactly is coming, Michael?" He smirked. "Whatever you want." For the first time in a long time, she believed it. She wasn't just the woman who had risked her life that night. She was someone who had taken control of her own story. And whatever the future held, she was ready. If you enjoyed this story of courage, fate, and unexpected connections, don't forget to like and subscribe for more engaging narratives. What are your thoughts on Ruth's journey? Do you think she made the right choice that night? How do you feel about how everything turned out between her and Michael? Rate the story on a scale of 1 to 10 and let us know in the comments. Also, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know.